Right. Hi, everyone. A very, very warm welcome to today's LEAP webinar. I'm Nora, your host for this session on making sense of data governance in resource management. And I'm thrilled to have you all here as we dive into this crucial and evolving topic. As a new work and transformation consultant, my passion lies in helping organizations and individuals unlock their full potential by creating more adaptive, soulful, and joyful ways of working. My mission is to inspire fresh perspectives on how we think, work, and collaborate. And today's discussion on data governance is a key part of that journey. And to get us started, let's take a quick pulse check. Before we dive in, I'd love to get a sense for who's here with us in this room. And we've prepared a short poll to understand the biggest data governance challenge in your organization. So feel free to have a look. What's your biggest challenge in data governance? It might be ensuring data quality and consistency, or educating stakeholders on its importance, keeping data across multiple systems and teams, or keeping data processed timely and accurate. It might be reporting or something else. If it's something else, feel free to share it in the chat. And here we go. We'll leave this open for a few seconds. I'm curious to see what the result will be. All right, Edom, feel free to close, and let's have a look at the result. All right, here we go. With about 45%, the biggest challenge seems to be integrating data across multiple systems and teams. Then next up, with 25%, we've got ensuring data quality and consistency. And 20% of you have challenges educating stakeholders on the importance of data governance. Thank you very much for voting. We'll make sure we keep this in mind as we dive into the discussion today. This webinar is part of RUN's LEAP webinar series, LEAP Igniting the Future of Resource Management. At RUN, we believe resource management is more than just schedules and spreadsheets. It's about creating smarter, more human-centered ways of working. And with LEAP, our goal is to challenge traditional approaches, spark fresh ideas, and bring inspiring new perspectives to the resource management community. Together, we'll explore what the future of resource management could and should look like. This webinar is brought to you by RUN. RUN helps teams effortlessly match the right people to the right work, making resource management smoother, smarter, and less of a headache. We'll use the last 15 minutes for question and answers, so feel free as we dive into our discussion to capture any questions you might have on the topic of data governance in the Q&A section. Also feel free to use the chat. It's always very lovely when there is some activity happening. Also feel free to use the interactions that Zoom webinar offers. Any reactions are very, very welcome. So we know that you're there and we're not alone. Next up, I'm excited to introduce today's fantastic panelists, Martha Arias-Webster and Gary Ward. First, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Martha Arias-Webster, Resource Management Leader at Jobs for the Future, back to the LEAP stage. Martha joined us last year in January for our most popular webinar to date on resource management mistakes to avoid, and we're thrilled to have her with us again. As a board member of the Resource Management Institute and a holder of multiple certifications, Martha brings a wealth of strategic expertise and a deep passion for advancing best practices in resource management. Martha, it's so wonderful to have you here again.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. And we're also incredibly excited to welcome back Gary Ward, Director of the Resource Management Office at Guidewire Software. Gary is the founding member of a centralized resource management office, leading a global team that supports the professional service business across America, EMEA, and APAC. With over 20 years of experience in business operations, process efficiency, and resource management, plus his role on the advisory board of the Resource Management Institute, Gary brings invaluable insights to today's discussion on data governance. Gary, you're making leap history as the first speaker to join us 3 times, and we could not be more grateful. Martha and Gary, we're so excited for today's conversation. Thank you both for being here.
Thanks, Nora.
All right, in our webinar today, we will explore the critical role of data governance in resource management, what it is, why it matters, and how to get it right. To kick us off, let's dive into data governance and the terminology. What exactly does data governance mean, and why is it important? And Gary, I would love for you to kick us off.
Sure. So I suppose when you hear of data governance, you know, some people might confuse it with data management. So if we kind of split the two almost. So data management is focused on the operational side of things, maybe the physical execution of data handling, storage, integration, things of that nature. Data governance is really the overarching framework of your policies, the standards, and the accountability on that data. So it's really talking about data quality and the compliance. So in other words, data governance kind of sets the rules, if you will, around your data. I'd say that it's important on multiple fronts, but it's because of what I'd call a kind of an expansive downstream effect, right? So from a compliance perspective, it could be potentially regulatory, for example. Down to the efficiency in what we track, retain, or report on. And ultimately, it improves decision making as it relates to more kind of reliable and consistent and informative insights. RM is very focused on those business insights, and data governance is really kind of an important aspect of that to get that right.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic definition. Thank you for getting us started. Martha, is there anything you would like to add? What does it mean to you, and why is it important from your perspective?
Yeah, I love the definition that Gary gave and the context also provided. I mean, I would also say those governing processes and procedures that define how the data is actively maintained. It could even include, you know, access levels of who has rights to update, change data, what profiles people have, and what they can see in different systems. And it can include key corporate data, often especially for professional services firms, when we're talking about deploying resources can be one of the largest cost items for many companies. I know it is for mine. And so that data is really critical, not only for the company, maintaining who's on what, you know, how deeply people are involved in terms of like hours and allocations, but it's really important to resource management. So we care a lot about it in resource management, and I know that's what we're here to dive in deeper to today.
Absolutely. So data is the most critical aspect, arguably, for a resource manager. So data governance is basically the framework of ensuring that the data has the sufficient accuracy and quality to do the job correctly. Thank you for kicking us off. So now I wonder if we dive into specifically the role of the resource manager in the space of data governance. How would you define the role of the resource manager, and what might be out of scope?
Yeah, should I go ahead and get us started? I would say for resource manager, we are expected to understand the variety of data sources that are pertinent to our daily work. And oftentimes we use the data to forecast outcomes, make recommendations, and properly deploy staff. I think that's a critical element. So RMs or resource managers should be actively involved in the process. We need to have a deep understanding of what data elements are needed in order to execute the resource management processes, whether it be forecasting or staffing, and understanding who updates those data elements and what's under your purview. In terms of what's out of scope, um, I would say there's not a lot that's out of scope. There may be certain things that are more tangential to resource management. Perhaps, the background integration, we're not driving that process. Oftentimes, that's usually managed within IT and operations, but we do have a say in advocating for the right levels of frequency of data updates in order to ensure our processes are reliable and repeatable and that they can be used for the right outcomes.
Nice, a quite active role, I hear you say. Beautiful. Gary, how would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I love what Martha said already. I think, ORMs need to be fully engaged in data governance, right? And we're in a prime position to do so. Um, ORMs notoriously have an enormous amount of information at their disposal or at their fingertips. But in order to do that justice, the processes surrounding it, to Martha's point, need to be governed, the compliance monitored around data, and the integrity maintained, because your insights are only ever going to be as good as the data you're leveraging, right? So if we think about it, we consistently hear about, caution buzzword, data-driven, right? Data-driven insights, data-driven decisions. And if we think about the crux of that, how can those decisions be made with data that's either inaccurate or a data pool that's troublesome? Right? I'd argue it can't. So, in fact, data and data governance are always even a great place to start from when thinking about processes, because it means you can kind of plan out what will be important and how to get to that information prior to kind of even architecting some of the processes themselves. So it's almost reverse engineering some of it. So ORMs have a huge role in this, and to Martha's point, there may be some things that are out of scope. I think what she touched on was perfect. Any of that kind of some of the more technical aspects, your IT, your biz tech teams. There's a lot of function in a lot of functions that have different subsets of data within an organization, of course. So I suppose just understanding the parameters around, this can grow legs and walk, right? So if RM becomes the full data governance for the entire organization, that can be tricky. I think we need to lean into the RM focused areas. And then to Martha's point, maybe even broadcast and speak about the importance of data governance, data quality that has a wider reach, maybe beyond that.
Advocate for the importance. I think that's
Right.
well said. And now let's really dive into the best practices. I'm really, really keen to share some of your insights that we had the pleasure of talking about previously in our prep sessions, because there is so much, right? So let's get started. Best practices in the space of data governance for resource managers and adjacent roles. What have you seen working really well? What would you advise or maybe inspire others to consider moving forward? Gary, would you like to start off?
Yeah, I think, the poll mentioned a couple of things that brings some other ideas to mind, particularly around the communication, enablement, kind of speaking the same language within the organization, right? So if you're going to roadshow or release information or reports around standards around data governance, data integrity, a data governance committee could, do a very, very good job of bringing people together across the organization. Beyond that, you can look towards data stewards within different functions, within different business units, because that can help drive some of the accountability and that importance as well. But the kind of auditing of the processes, broadcasting of the compliance areas. So when I think about compliance, I almost think about it around kind of putting scoring mechanisms around some of this, right? So you can look towards configuring your PSA, PPM, or in-house tool, whichever it is you use, to, automate notifications, restrict certain actions based on a data mapping table, for example, down to the level of highlighting existing inconsistencies in your data for kind of validation checks and whatnot. So, there's multiple things available to us. In my opinion, and based on many conversations, the role of ORM is large, but the focus, in my view, is obviously, again, the governance of very ORM related topics and themes, because, we will kind of live and die by the data, right? So we have to kind of feed ourselves first, serve ourselves first, somewhat selfishly, to ensure that the information we have is as strong as it possibly can be to make those informed decisions.
Absolutely. Wow. Great start. I love your idea of the data governance committee. Just on that, how would you advise for that to look like? Who would be part of it? How would it work practically?
Any stakeholder you're dealing with that has an eye for detail are great people to get on board straight away, because they're probably already seeing this, highlighting it themselves. They might feel like they're kind of pushing a boulder up a mountain sometimes as well. So it's good to get some connections there. I think any of the other, there's strong parts of the organization that are heavily focused on some of this, for different reasons, right? But again, it's about what the data is serving. So if you think about FP&A or finance functions, right? Very important to them. Equally as important to functions like HR, talent acquisition as well. So it's just kind of looking across the organization and working with like-minded people, especially ones that are already kind of somewhat advocating for it, or frustrated by the lack of data integrity or issues that are popping up as they try to navigate the business, right, and understand the metrics and the information that's out there.
Fantastic. And just to be super clear, what exactly is the difference then to the stewards, the data stewards and the different business units?
Data stewards, I mean, it's essentially having advocates within different business units and across different functions, right? So it's bringing someone into the fold. They could or could not be a member of the committee itself. If they're not, it's someone with kind of boots on the ground, working with the rest of their team, working with their colleagues, advocating for it, and making sure that it comes up in conversation. It's not lost in terms of actions and processes and steps that are taken.
Beautiful. Yeah. That's a very effective way, both the committee as well as the data stewards, to get allies for this topic, right? So you're basically helping spread the accountability across the organization.
That's right.
You're smart. Thanks, Gary. Martha, what is top of your mind when it comes to best practices in data governance?
Yeah, so I just want to add also one other group that came to mind as Gary was speaking is that if you have a data analytics team, that team will have skin in the game too, because they're probably looking at a lot of the same data elements and able to also spot any anomalies or trends within your data, within like large data sets. So I think having somebody on that committee, that data governance committee from that team, could also add some benefit as well. Top of mind for me, I think, is making sure that as a resource manager or even a resource management leader, that you're understanding that those data elements, and also like your broader data environment. So I think one thing I want to call out, which I know we have as a tool for discussion today, is a data map. Really taking the time to map out your business processes and the different elements that pertain to your resource management function. Thank you for pulling that up. So really this gets into, a hypothetical project life cycle. It could even be a product life cycle if you do product management, or any internal initiatives. It can be an initiative life cycle, but really calling out the critical data elements that pertain to the resource management function. So like Gary said, zero in on where resource management needs to focus. Is it, planned start and end dates, allocations of staff, duration of those staff members, the scope or skills needed per role. And then what you could do on the bottom row is really take the time to say, okay, where does this data reside? What is the source system for this information? Maybe you have information that's parsed out across systems, or maybe you even want to call out that there's certain things that are not in your core systems and are maintained on the side in spreadsheets somewhere. I think that's important to even call out and dissect. And then what we have called out here is that you can grade the different quality of the data elements or the system maintenance quality as well, so that red, yellow, green, saying, okay, this data is really well maintained, or perhaps certain data elements fall out of maintenance at certain intervals. You want to really call that out in order to understand how is the governance working and where are there opportunities to improve. As you move on as well, are there, start and end dates? Are they being maintained? Or during the project execution, do things get extended? And oftentimes we can be surprised. No, we're extending someone's time. We haven't seen it yet. Making sure that you are looking end to end on your life cycle, understanding the data elements and where they are from a quality perspective has been really helpful for me, especially as I've been at 3 different organizations standing up resource management processes. So this is a tool I keep in my toolkit, especially in my first 30 to 90 days. This is something that I'm actively doing.
Amazing. I think it's such a great structure. It might look different case to case, organization to organization, but this is such a good blueprint. So Martha has kindly and generously agreed that we can distribute this to everyone present at the webinar today. So you get access to this, which basically with the permission of Martha, we can distribute it, which we're very, very grateful for. Thank you so much. And while we're at it, Martha, you have prepared another interesting asset. So while I'm sharing, maybe we can talk about that, which is the value stream mapping. Maybe if we focus on the slide, that's most helpful. Can you take us through what's the idea of the value stream mapping? How can it be of benefit to resource managers?
Absolutely. So when we think about resource management, oftentimes we're coming with this expertise of we know what we need to staff team members. We know what we need to forecast, but we need to be mindful that not everyone else in the organization knows what a resource management team is doing. I think that's one thing that it's a running joke in resource management. What are the misconceptions amongst other groups and departments and what they think resource management does. So it's really important to go in with that lens when you're talking about broad data governance processes and procedures. You have to start with explaining to other departments why you're looking at this data. Why is it important? So you want to make it relevant for them so they can understand they're updating these, let's say they're updating 4 data elements. And there are several processes removed from your resource management process. So in this example, process 1 is your deal information, right? New projects coming into your system. They might be in a request format if it's internal work. They might be in a deal proposal format if it's external client-facing work. So there's information being entered upstream. And when you're having conversations with those teams, you want to be able to call out the value stream or the life cycle of the data and then how it's being used later so that those stakeholders earlier on can realize the relevance and importance of those data elements that they're entering and then how important it is to keep that data maintained. So you want to take it to their process, describe their process and say, okay, did you know that in your from your pipeline information, I'm actually running a process on it where I take the information, I aggregate it, and I analyze it. And it may even be in a different system, right? Because I know a lot of the survey came back and talking about data integration. So data is flowing from system to system. And then in process 3, this is where resource management is doing a forecast off of the pipeline. So this is where you can start to make connections with other departments and say, this is the value, is why it's called a value stream of your information. The value is in the decisions that we can make and the actions we can make later off of this data. So it's really important, critical data. And that's what you're really trying to get them to understand. What is resource management doing with the data? Okay. So now we go to process 4. You can talk to this stakeholder and say, hey, did you know that in process 4, we can actually hire based off of deals that we're projecting to come in? And we want to hire in advance of the project being started so that we can be ready on, let's call it day 0 of that project kickoff. So did you know that if your data is out of date, that in process 4, we're not able to make the right decisions? And I think that's where you can educate your stakeholders and say, your data is valuable, it needs to be governed, and this is how we use it. This is how we use it downstream, and there's different stakeholders involved. And so this is how you can build awareness and build support for people taking the extra time to maintain the data to the frequency that the business needs to come up with the right outcomes. And then with process 5, you're talking about, project staffing, and whether it's a product build out or it's a project delivery, that's really where you're trying to highlight. All of these processes are interconnected. Resource management is core, but also so are these other data elements and processes upstream.
So powerful. And I think it was top 3 in our quick poll earlier, right? Is helping other stakeholders play their part in the data governance field. So this is such a valuable tool for just helping understand how it's all interconnected and how a resource manager can only do a great job when there is also support from the different parts of the organization. It's a team game. Nice. Thank you so much for taking us through this. So to everyone listening now, this might be a new idea for you. If you have any questions, feel very invited to capture any questions in the Q&A, and we'll happily come back to that to cover anything that might have been unclear. Gary, you also have a goodie for us, and I'm so keen to share it with everyone. So what is the idea of what you have shared with us? I'll bring it up here.
Yeah, so look, just very, very straightforward, basic, quick fire things that come to mind around things that are in your system, right? And they're very kind of, as mentioned earlier on, RM focused in the sense of, internally looking across the RMO team at the level of accuracy and validating that information, right? So when we look towards resource requests and assignments, because they're core kind of objects and things that we're looking at on a regular basis, we're looking towards, active requests on canceled projects, for example. Some very, very basic stuff here. Part-time requests where, your hours are definitely over allocated. The requested hours aren't aligning to that. Skills gaps are huge, right? And again, depending on how much automation there is or who is entering that data, you can have gaps here all over the place, depending on, you might have a resource role, you might have the hours in there, everything else is tallying, but there's no skills associated, right? That can cause a major problem from a capacity planning perspective. Backdated start dates, problematic for a number of reasons, right? Not to mention your financial forecast, the accuracy of that. And to Martha's point earlier on, kind of mapping tables around your data and how you leverage that data and how things are associated. If there's rules and kind of setups around defined roles, matching skill sets, and whatnot, that's also very important. From a financial perspective, rates, right? Rates that match what we're putting into the system in terms of roles, levels, skill sets. Assignments, very much the same thing. If there's end dates in the past, assignments that are active and should be closed out, just keeping a general standard of hygiene around the objects. And, sometimes this falls by the wayside because if you've got, pre-filtered reports that only look at something that is, within a specific time period or falls outside of a forecast category, and everybody has this in their business, right? What can happen is the focus is on kind of what's coming and what you're planning for, and everything that's kind of beyond that or that's filtered out is still sitting there stale in the system, right? So what needs to be deleted, what needs to be canceled, what needs to be cleaned up is an important step as well. It doesn't have to be done on an incredibly regular basis, but even doing some of those things on a quarterly or a monthly basis will suffice. Even if you roll that out to individual resource managers for their book of business or their business unit that they're working with, just to keep the hygiene there. So it's just some very simple, tips and tricks and things that you can look at. This list would have gone on and on. So these were just top of mind as we were speaking about it.
Yeah, thank you so much for getting us started with that. And I'm sure only here in the room with over 40 people, we could add to that. So maybe that's something we might look into doing at some point, just sharing best practices in that space. But a great starter. Thank you so much for sharing. And also we are happy to distribute that after the webinar to everyone who's interested. I would also love to think about the framework we discussed in our previous prep talk around people, process, and tech. So when we look at people, Martha, what springs to your mind? How does the people component play into data governance on top of what we have already covered? How can we utilize this dimension of people for our advantage?
Yeah, I would say, people play a critical role. We talked about, having our stakeholders be educated on processes and how data is used. I think that's an eternal, like evergreen need. Why? Why is it a constant need to educate? Because people at your organization change, right? People come, they move departments, they leave organizations, new people come in, and before you know it, you're re-educating your stakeholders on these same principles. And so make it an annual event that make sure you're talking to those new leaders if you have access to them, especially in those critical departments where those data elements are maintained. Make sure you're training people. And this could be across the organization. If you have multiple people in the organization that serve as project leads, them maintaining their project data is critical. I would also say having workshops where the data governance is hashed out. So if there's questions on who maintains what, bring those together with those stewards and have those conversations. So people understanding the impacts, where they play a role, ownership role, those are all really critical in my book when we're talking about people and data governance.
I love the idea of the workshops. Is it the resource manager's role to initiate that, or how do you see, is it a participant? How does the resource manager or the leader of the RMO play into this, I wonder?
Yeah, I feel like I sound the buzzer on people and say this I'm kind of joking a bit, but we are looking at the information with such scrutiny within resource management that we are knowing when things are out of sync or it becomes a trend. So no, we're not the accountable party to maintain that data, but we have skin in the game because, as Gary mentioned, if we're using that data to go in front of leadership, that I do feel a level of accountability in making sure it's right and that I'm able to voice over where we can make improvements. And based off my space, I often have to, yes, create momentum in other parts of the organization to take action. So if we go back to that data map and there's some critical data that's a red or an orange, yes, you should talk to your resource management leader on, hey, what can we be doing to improve these critical elements that we use for our processes? I do believe that there is some onus there, even though you may not be, the accountable party to enter it, but thinking about what processes can be put in place to create the visibility and to create action, that could be an area to be explored for sure for the resource management team or office.
And it very much contributes to an overarching theme we have been seeing in almost every webinar, which is the shift from a reactive to a proactive mindset, which I think the RM professional can champion for the organization, right? So instead of waiting until something is not working or, causing pain, to already have that foresight and proactively think about ways of addressing it, improving it for the benefit of the organization. That's really the superpower of the resource manager, from what I can see, which is super exciting, such a purposeful role in the organization. Gary, is there anything else on people you would like to add above and beyond what we have covered, or shall we move on to process?
I might cross both a little bit. I loved what Martha said, and I think it's some of what we're hearing here, thematically at least, is when we think about the people, it is the enablement, it is the communication, it is the collaboration, right? Change management too, as far as processes go. It's funny in a webinar about governance, it's data governance, but governance nonetheless, to say you don't want to become the police, right? So, and what I mean by that is if you go too far down the path of policing everything and everyone, it can be problematic to try and roll that back out of that position. And equally, I suppose from a stakeholder management perspective, the ORM organization, or whether it's a single ORM or multiples, but can be kind of seen through a very specific lens. They're going to be onto me this week. They're going to be sharing this data. They're going to be. So I think the more partnership there is, the more advocacy there is, the more those stewards there are, the better it will stand to you. Certainly on the people side. Processes are kind of, again, it's funny if you talk too much about process, or the tool that we're looking at or leveraging data from, for example, a lot of the times you've lost your audience, right? So the biggest challenge kind of in data governance is the value proposition, or maybe even the negative consequences of bad data, or data that's not being governed, let's put it that way. So again, whether you reverse engineer that or lean into the positives or the negatives, but depending on the stakeholder. But again, if we talk too long about process and go too into the weeds with some of the stakeholders, they'll miss the point, right? So really sticking with the high level value prop. This is what it is. This is what it does. And if we fire wrong here, these are the consequences, right? So really getting everybody to kind of buy into that, to understand it, is key. The processes are there. You've architected them. You've documented them. Hopefully you've road showed them, right? And governance on the data or the processes comes from that kind of reporting aspect, right? Being able to what Martha was sharing earlier on, the red, amber, green is really, really cool. Like, I can't overemphasize that enough. Because at a high level, a senior stakeholder can go, we're in the red. Something's wrong. It requires attention. This is what I'm looking at, right? So it's a very easy way to kind of capture an audience's attention, and throw their eye to the most important things that they need to be aware of. And even if the ORM organization isn't, to Martha's point earlier on, accountable for all of it, it can showcase some of that information, right? Share the reports, talk about it, document it, and kind of keep moving the organization forward in that respect.
Yeah, amazing. I love that so much. Don't lose people by getting too much into the weeds of the process. Completely agree. And I think the way the two of you talk about data governance makes it so inviting to think about the topic, right? So always keep your audience in mind, what speaks to them, right? Can you simplify? Can you use the red, orange, green way of making it a bit more simple to understand? Yeah, that's awesome. And I love your point around don't become the police. Instead, focus on partnership and advocacy. That's super smart and makes your role a lot more pleasant. Now let's also look into tech. What, Martha, would you say are some best practices when it comes to tech and data governance?
Yeah, I would say think about how technology, especially how AI can help you in looking at some of those data elements. I think that if you can build some logic trees like how Gary fleshed out in his slide there that he shared, that you can take some of that work off your plate. If there's certain things that are out of sync, have the system flag that if you're able to do that. And so we don't have, team members who have to run around and remind people. I think one thing that comes to mind for me is if you can have a system build certain logical relationships. I'll give you just one example. You can take some work off your plate. So let's say you have a monthly deactivation process when someone's offboarded, right? You can build logic trees that say, okay, if this in this list of deactivations, let's make that a trigger to check against who's a project lead or who's a resource, and then make sure that that gets flagged in the way that's appropriate so that you don't have things, data elements that are critical that are becoming stale. So the system can help remind you when things are becoming out of date and need a review. That will help lift that off your plate and off of the RM team's plate. So the resource management team can focus on staffing, deployment, and then maybe some of those triggers and flags can be looked at, weekly, bi-weekly for an update. And you can involve different parts of your organization in that, depending on how it pertains to them. So leverage technology, leverage your PSA, your PPM tool to help you with that if you're in a level 3 maturity and above.
I love it. So data governance is basically the foundation in order to leverage AI, and you can use AI to help you with your data governance. So that, you laid out brilliantly. I love that full cycle moment I'm just having. Thank you.
And Nora,
Yeah.
just to Bertha's point, I mean, some of this is, yes, it's technology related, it's AI. But one of the things that she mentioned here is actually quite important, that there's always going to be some level of operational or administrative debt for the organization, including the RM team and some of the other functions of the business. So the more you can kind of optimize the processes, more standards you can bring into the tools and the technology to help you. Admin and the burden is kind of off your plate, right? To Martha's point, you can actually focus on the more strategic elements of the role, because if you get enough RMs in a room together or talking about this, there is constant kind of theme of moving out from the tactical reactive state, right? The only way you can do that is by reducing some of those tasks that are there in the backlog that you need to work through. They have to be done, but if you can optimize for them and leverage the technology to do so, great. And the point around AI actually assisting with this, you can have detection of emissions in terms of the data. It can go as far as suggestive actions based on maybe mapping tables and things like that, or in fact direct corrections to the data, right, itself based on some of those rules and some of the standards that you set up. So the sky's the limit here as far as future direction. But much like a process or tool, you can't really automate something that's not working effectively already or is operationally or that has a strong standard there. So it's key to obviously have some of those processes in place.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for adding to that. Now is your chance to capture any questions you might have on the topic of data governance. You have the unique opportunity to pick the brains of Martha and Gary. So use this opportunity. For your information, any questions that we will not be able to cover right now and here in this webinar, we will actually take some time after the webinar to answer any outstanding questions and record this session and share it with you. So it's always worthwhile capturing any questions. They will all be seen and answered. So I would like to pick the first question, and if you could help me prioritize the ones you find most interesting, that would be helpful. You can just upvote questions you want to be answered right now. I'm going to go with the first question that was posed by Charlie. And Charlie says, would you say a resource manager should be its own role, or is this something that can be an additional role alongside someone's existing responsibilities? Okay, a more general question. I've seen you nod. Gary, do you want to start us off?
Well, it's funny to answer this question because, I suppose for myself and Martha, we're very biased. In my opinion, there's enough scope for this to be its own role, for sure. Um, I have seen and spoken with people where they've had some elements of, let's say, RM duties and tasks designated to them, but they do have a different day-to-day role or a different title, let's say. Um, so look, people can multitask, they can, span multiple different things that they're, working on. Um, but, to be completely frank, I think there's so much scope in resource management that if it is its own role, it can really deliver on the value proposition of what RM brings. Sole focus. And make no mistake about it, no matter how small or large the organization is, even with one RM, there'll be plenty of work for that one RM just solely dedicated to resource management, other than, some of those duties living elsewhere.
Nice. Thank you, Gary. Martha, anything you would like to add?
I would just, in addition, say there are some key benefits to having it be its own sole role, including um, things like impartiality of resource allocations, for example. I have seen with some companies where a project manager's role is also to acquire resources for their own projects. And I've seen that lead to self-driven behavior and this is something that I say, I've I'm a certified project manager. I started off as a project manager, and so I love project management and project managers. I will also state that if a project manager functions as a resource manager, which projects do they care about? I can tell you the ones I cared about. They were the ones I was leading, but not the other 50 projects that were happening at the same time. So I think that if you really want an impartial, best optimized deployment of resources, then it should be a resource management function, whatever you call it, that it should be its own role.
Nice.
And
Awesome.
again, yes, biased.
Thank you both very much. Just for our audience benefit, your teams, how large are there? Are they?
I have a small
Martha?
team, 3 of us.
So
We're constantly trying to grow our team.
yeah, nice. And Gary?
A team of 9 managing upwards of 800 FTEs.
Yeah, so we can already see there's enough work on your plate. So probably the recommendation for it to be its own role, depending on the context, if that's possible, that would be probably the best option. Thank you, Charlie, for your question. Let's move on to the next one from Kutanda. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you for your question. What is the bigger financial risk? Inaccurate workforce capacity forecasting or poor headcount cost tracking? Shall I repeat, or did you get it on the first read?
I'm just reading over it again here. I'll take a stab at this. I'm not sure if I'm going to hit it, exactly how the question is structured here, but um, they both have a financial risk, right? So I see them kind of they're not one and the same, but there is a correlation, right? To me, when I think of inaccurate workforce capacity forecasting, it's your forecast. You may not have taken any actions yet, right? You may not have increased headcount, decreased headcount, taken steps to, manage your supply to meet that demand or whatever the case may be, right? So, to a certain degree, the headcount cost tracking comes front and center for me because that's the overhead. It's a consistent cost that's there in every organization, right? So you need to be able to understand what those costs look like, because that needs to be offset on your P&L through something like a billable utilization, right? So that cost is always sitting there. So I'd kind of lean more towards that. Um, but even when we get into anything around workforce capacity forecasting, and I like the question because to a certain degree, that tactical, reactive, short-term staffing that RMs have to do has very, very little to do with long-term strategic capacity planning for an organization, right? So I think we need to divorce these two things on a regular basis in RM because sometimes they get lumped together and they're actually quite different. So even when you're thinking about that workforce capacity forecasting, if your costs are in place and you've got good visibility of that and everything is quantifiable, right? You can equally do the same thing from a billable perspective, what capacity you have to deliver revenue. Whether you look at optimal, meaning maybe, which probably isn't realistic, but 100% of the available hours, people are going to be doing billable work. It's probably not going to happen, right? But then you've got something like effective planning for that. So what are those utilization targets, which are already factored into the role, the level, the skill, and whatnot, to try and understand, again, what capacity you have to be able to deliver revenue effectively. So it's a stab at the question. There could be a bit more to this, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for giving it a go, Gary. Much appreciated. Martha, is there anything that springs to your mind to add?
Yeah, it's a hard question. So kudos to Krutanda that gave us a very tricky financial question for the day. I would say, but I am in line with Gary. I do agree that they're both risk factors. I worry about the poor headcount cost tracking because that's really your margin and your cost of services. And if you don't have a handle or your business doesn't have a handle on your cost of services, that's a red alert, right? Because you could be operating at a loss. And I think this is why it's so important to separate these two. I see these being two different functions entirely, where you have your financial department that's really looking at what should your price targets be, how much do things cost, versus how are we forecasting the needs we have for tomorrow. So very different things, and both super important, which is why I believe that the functions reside in different parts of the house. But it's important for you as a resource manager to partner with your finance team to make sure that you're thinking about things like your utilization and how you're applying the right staff to the right work. So for example, if you're overstaffing, and when I'm overstaffing in that, if you have a scope of work come in and you're putting your A1 expensive resources, you can't put them on everything, right? There's certain models that need to be maintained in terms of the resources that you deploy, how senior they are to the type of work, the complexity. The simple work can go to more junior staff, and that will account for differences in how much things should be costing when you deliver the services. So you do as a resource manager need to think about optimally deploying your resources in the right places.
Nice. Thank you so much for your additional thoughts on this question. And thank you, Kutanda, for raising this question in the first place. We have a few minutes left, so I invite us to do a quick round on this next question. It goes like this: what does automation in resource management look like? So maybe just a few thoughts. Gary, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, we mentioned earlier on some sort of data mapping or a table that kind of relates multiple different objects, multiple different fields within systems. And it also touches on maybe what came up in the poll around integration of systems too, right? So what does automation in RM look like? To me, I always go after that administrative debt, which I mentioned earlier on. What are the day-to-day activities that, while necessary for the business, don't deliver a ton of value, right? Again, absolutely critical, absolutely necessary. These steps and activities must happen, but are they really value add and are they the best use of somebody's time? They're the key areas to start looking at for automation, right? It could be, it depends maybe on the scope of your resource manager, your resource management organization. What are they actually accountable for? And I don't mean that from a, you know, resource pool kind of talent supply chain perspective. I mean, are they physically managing the PSA or the PPM tool, the data accuracy, the data entry into that? Is that administrative kind of debt sitting with the RM organization, or is it with the delivery teams itself? If it's with RM, there's so much scope to do as much automation as possible. And I feel this way around kind of, Martha might have mentioned it earlier on, kind of a deal review, right? We were talking about the slide that she was sharing. So you think about a deal review or you think about a deal desk at a high level, how the process flow works and what systems are connected and why, right? At a high level, if you're, large enough organization and you've invested both time, effort, and money into technology, you need to be leveraging it in the right way, and ensuring that from the start of the sales pipeline, that you've got that visibility tracking through. And if there's core data sets that exist on an opportunity, they should probably map over to a project automatically, for example. So it either saves the delivery team time or saves the RM time in managing some of these things that is almost duplicative effort, if you will. So just top of mind.
Nice. Thank you very much. Martha, a very quick answer. Anything?
Yes, I would just say staffing recommendations, right? One thing that we're working on is launching an algorithm that helps us look at skills requested per role and helping us come up with the best match based off of allocation needs, time span, level, aka cost, right? Cost of the role and the skills. So we're looking to release a staffing assistant, if you will, that helps us come up with the best match and then take it to the final step of saying, okay, the algorithm has given us these 3 people who are the top matches. Now let's take it the final step and use our, relationships and human skills to see who is the right match that we're going to recommend for that work. So that could be one way that you automate.
Very, very nice. And we'll actually dive into the skills topic in our next webinar. So that's a great segue. And thank you very much also for your answer, Martha. So we have 2 outstanding questions. Feel free to use these last few seconds also to shoot any question that is on top of your mind into the Q&A. We will tackle them and you will get a recording of those outstanding questions. Absolutely. So it's already time to say goodbye. It's been an absolute pleasure, Martha and Gary, to have you back at the LEAP webinar program. Thank you so much for generously sharing your expertise, your experiences, your insights, and best practices on this very, very important topic of data governance. It's much appreciated.
Thanks, Nora. Thanks, Martha.
Thank you.
And just a quick shout out to Run's new reports module, which includes many more tools, display options, metrics, and functionality. So feel free to check that out. And also a heads up, our upcoming webinar in March will tackle skills management, best practices to maximize your team's talent. It will happen on the 19th of March. We would love to see you there. We will be welcoming Sid. I think she's also joining us here today, Julie and Ollie. So we would love to see you there. So thank you all very, very much for joining us today. It's been a big pleasure and I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day, wherever you are in the world. Take good care. Bye.